Welcome back to Educator.com. Today we're going to look at budget deficits and the national debts. So in today's lesson overview, we're going to describe the budget balance as a measure of fiscal policy. We're going to discuss whether or not the budget should be balanced. Notice the word should right here. This is a normative question here. We're going to review the problems posed by rising government debt, something that in the United States it's clearly going to be a problem. And we're going to examine the role of debt to GDP ratio in determining what amount of debt is acceptable in a country. And then we're going to understand the impending crisis of implicit liabilities that will surely hit the United States barring major entitlement reforms. So in this class, there's not a whole lot of politics per se. So understanding this, if you're also taking the AP government class, understanding the role of Social Security and Medicare, that's actually part of the AP government class. In this class, we're going to look at obviously from more of the macroeconomic perspective, but we're going to see what the role that Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, these things have in terms of government fiscal policy. All right, so the budget balance. So let's take a look at budget balance. Very simple. When you're dealing with the budget balance, if you take the American household, if you take the U.S. government as an American household, well, all the money coming in, that's the income, and it comes in the form of tax revenue, and all the money that goes out in the form of either government spending or transfer payments. So when you look at the U.S. government as a household, so to speak, then the budget balance might make a whole lot more sense. So the government savings is defined by the following equation. Again, some people might actually have an issue with the idea of the government saving because, how is the government actually saving? They're saving American taxpayers' money, which, if you think about it, theoretically is really belong to them. But nuances aside here, government savings, so S government, equals T minus G minus TR. And so T equals the taxes. So all the taxes that are coming in whatever form, whether it's the federal income tax, whether it's the estate tax or gift tax or any type of tariff, that's the amount of money coming in. G is going to be government spending. So this is all the money that's going out that's being spent on different goods and services. So again, that's going to be an expense that is added to the government. So that's why it's a negative, whereas taxes are positive. And then you have TR. TR stands for transfer payments. See, all the money that's going out in the form of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, any payments that's being made out, that's similar to government spending. Now, we don't call it government spending because this is money that's already owed to the people, and it's kind of like a cash flow, so to speak. So another way to look at this, we're going to look at it is in terms of implicit liabilities. When we're dealing with the budget balance, Social Security and Medicare, these two expenditures, they have a huge impact on the future fiscal outlook of the United States. So again, that's what it is here. So again, you get the tax revenues, and that's money that's coming in. You have the government purchases of goods and services, that's money that's going out. And then you also have the government transfers, which is also going out. So when you take the taxes and you subtract these two different things, this is the government savings that occur. Okay, so as a rule of thumb, expansionary fiscal policies serve to reduce the budget balance. For example, it's either going to decrease the budget surplus or increase the budget deficit. So as a reminder, what is expansionary fiscal policy? So expansionary fiscal policy is going to be either increase government spending or you reduce taxes, or the third one is increase transfer payments. So if you do that, and then let's say you had a budget surplus, Well, if you use expansionary measures, then the surplus you have is going to reduce, or if you're already in the budget, or if you're in a budget deficit already, the budget deficit is going to increase. Again, in the late 2000s, around 2009, 2010, the U.S. budget deficit exceeded, $1 trillion. Reason being that, you're in kind of a recessionary times, but combined with the fact that the U.S. used expansionary fiscal policies, the government was spending more and also reducing taxes to try to stimulate the aggregate demand, shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. But in doing so, incurred a very gigantic budget deficit. So, it was great. It may have it may have helped save us in the short run from falling into a greater recession. But there are long-term consequences, and we had a deficit, and it kept on adding to our national debt. So, as a rule of thumb, again, generally, contractionary fiscal policies will increase the budget balance, or, for example, increase the budget surplus, or decrease the budget deficit. So, it works the other way. So let's go ahead and look at that. So what is contractionary fiscal policies? Well, expansionary is either increase government spending, decrease taxes, or increase transfer payments. Contractionary is exactly the opposite. You're either going to decrease, let's number these. You can either decrease government spending, you can either increase taxes, or you can decrease transfer payments. So this is what's meant by contractionary fiscal policy. Now, if you look at these different things in terms of increasing government spending, reducing taxes, and increasing transfer payments, if you look at this from a political perspective, it's pretty clear that what I wrote here in blue, expansionary policies, that's what's going to be very politically popular. You're giving money back, you're spending more money. It's very politically popular. Whereas the green one, contractionary, decreasing spending, increasing taxes, decreasing transfer payments, this is going to be very unpopular. So this might be the more responsible thing to do. But, expansionary is definitely more fun. People are going to prefer, more being spent. But usually, again, when you're dealing with politicians, usually, one political party will favor part of expansionary, but some contractionary measures. Again, as a crude representation, Republicans will tend to prefer reducing taxes and reducing government spending. So they'll take this portion here. They'll try to reduce taxes here, but they'll also try to decrease government spending and maybe decrease transfer payments as well. Whereas Democrats, again, this is a crude generalization, Democrats will tend to want to increase government spending or at least increase transfer payments. But the downside is that they're going to want to increase taxes as well, which is what Obama basically did, with increase of government spending, but an increase on the tax rates for the rich. Whereas, again, Republicans generally want to decrease taxes. President Bush in 2000, he's known for passing his Bush tax cuts, where he lowered the marginal rates on the entire population. The problem comes in when there's no responsibility, when members of both parties, they agree to increase government spending and reduce taxes and maybe not increase transfer payments, but they keep it stable. So again, this is really unpopular, but if you don't use any contractionary measures with expansionary, then what you end up having is you have an increased budget deficit. Again, this may stimulate the economy, aggregate demand in the short run, but now you're dealing with budget deficit problems when you're dealing just with this here. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. So in terms of a cyclically adjusted budget balance, what does it mean? So you're gonna have some periods of a budget surplus and a budget deficit, but the idea is that during different cycles, you might want to kind of adjust for periods of down times and periods of good times here. So what a cyclically adjusted budget balance is an estimate of what the budget balance would be if real GDP were exactly equal to potential output. So assume that there's no recessionary gap or no inflationary gap. Let's assume we're at the potential gap. And here's the reality. Government tax revenue will tend to rise and government transfers fall during economic expansions. So budget tends towards a surplus. Let's erase this extraneous and here. So in times of economic expansion, people have more jobs, so they're gonna pay more, so more tax revenue is gonna come in, and so the budgets will naturally tend towards a surplus. Again, conversely, tax receipts will decrease and government transfers are going to increase, meaning that the government's paying out more and less money is coming in during contractions. So the budget will tend towards a deficit. Again, these are what's called automatic stabilizers. So it makes sense that the government might spend a little bit more during recessionary times, and maybe during expansionary times they take in more through taxes. So the idea is that when you're dealing with a budget balance, it's okay in the short run to maybe incur a deficit, and at the same time, there's a surplus, but it doesn't mean that you get rid of the surplus, but you kind of save for a rainy day. And so this is the idea of looking holistically at the government budget balance. So here's the question. During recessionary times, is it the role of the government to actually step in and try to put in that extra stimulus, or is the goal of the government to balance the budget? So here's a normative question. Should the budget be balanced? Again, there's no correct answer because this is a normative question. If you're strictly wanting to keep the deficit, or to keep the budget balanced or keep a surplus, then you would say no. Then you would say yes, you want to keep the budget balanced. But if you're more believing that the government should take an active role in economic affairs, then while it would be ideal to balance the budget, the idea is that during recessionary times the government spends, but in contraction in times where there's inflation, maybe the government would contract and use some of that surplus here. Now, in the United States, there's been some movement, particularly within the Republican Party, most notably in 2010 with the emergence of the Tea Party. There's been a lot of clamoring for balancing the budget, but even before that, a lot of conservative Republicans thought that it'd be a good idea to balance the budget. So actually, a balanced budget amendment nearly passed through Congress to be sent to the states for ratification in 1994, but it fell 4 votes short of the 2/3 senators necessary in order to get it sent to the states for ratification. So there have been calls for the U.S. Congress to have the government have a balanced budget year in, year out. But again, it's lacked the 2/3 majority in Congress, and after that, it's got to go to 3/4 of the state legislatures in order to become an amendment to the Constitution. But that clearly has not happened. A good number of economists would argue against an amendment, as that would restrict a country's ability to run a budget deficit during recessions. So recessions would be worsened. So the idea is that if you have a balanced budget amendment, then your hands are tied and you no longer can utilize discretionary fiscal policy, similar to what happened in Europe when the euro basically made the currency the same in Germany, France, Italy. Basically, a lot of these countries, they ceded control of their monetary policy. So if there's a balanced budget amendment, the idea is that the government would have less control of their fiscal policy. Now, again, there's some good sides to that, some bad sides to that. As far as what's good or bad, the good thing about macroeconomics that might be a little bit more exciting than microeconomics, there's room for debate. In microeconomics, there's not a whole lot of disagreement. There's a whole lot of disagreement in macroeconomics. So there's one theory that, yes, the government should step in and prevent anything that would cause the economy to go into recession. And there are some folks that believe maybe that the government really, when they try to intervene, they make things worse off than it started off with here. So, however, when large deficits persist year after year, the national debt grows and grows and grows and grows. So maybe if you have a deficit in a couple of years, then it might be a good thing to go back into surplus. So perhaps deficits aren't too bad of a thing if it's maybe 2 or 3 years, but when every year is a deficit, a growing deficit, you can understand why some politicians might call for a little bit fiscal responsibility and maybe have a little austerity, maybe have a little bit of short-term pain for long-run gain. In the United States, again, the national debt in February of 2014 totaled to $17.3 trillion. There's a lot of different debt calculators that you can go online. But basically, when you accrue deficit after deficit after deficit year in, year out, then it goes to reason that the debt will just get massively higher and higher and higher, which is what it's done over the past couple of years. Okay, so what is the why is it wrong to have a lot of government debt? I mean, in theory, if you're making payments on time and you're not defaulting, then what's the problem? Well, there's some issues with that. The first one is this crowding out effect. So when the government borrows funds in the financial markets, it competes with private firms and therefore it crowds out private spending by raising interest rates and reducing long-run economic growth. Again, let's draw a little mini graph here. I didn't leave a whole lot of room here, and we've covered this before here. But let's say this is the quantity of loanable funds. Okay, if this is the quantity of loanable funds, this is the supply of loanable funds, and this is the demand for loanable funds, and this is going to be here the interest rate here. Okay, so this is interest rate. Again, what's going to happen is that when the government incurs a deficit, they're going to shift the demand for loanable funds to the right. And you have DL2 here instead of DL1. And what you have here is I1 is going to naturally go up to I2. And you have more loans out here, but what ends up happening, because the government comes in and increases the demand for loanable funds, the interest rates are going to go up. And that's what it means when private investment spending, it goes down, because with higher interest rates, businesses are less likely to take out more loans and to invest. So there's this opportunity cost that the government has when they spend, that's less money that the private sector will spend. So today's deficits increases the public debt, and so it puts financial strain on future budgets. So if you're constantly, running a budget deficit year in, year out, then there's going to be strain on the future. There's an opportunity cost, because future payments that could be made elsewhere is going to be made on the interest on the debt, and so this is kind of the opportunity cost of deficits. So like a consumer maxed out on credit cards, a government with rising amounts of debt may eventually default on payments. So if the debt gets too out of control, it's theoretically possible for the United States to default on payments. Now, has not happened as of the date of this filming. The U.S. has 100% paid back any debt it's issued, and therefore it's maintained a very good credit rating. Now, what would happen if the United States defaulted on its loans? Interest rates would go up, and there might be problems, right? In 2001, Argentina actually defaulted on its payments. Payments were getting out of control, and the thing about countries, when they don't make payments, you don't put a country in prison, or a country theoretically could decide not to make payments, but if it does that, then investors are going to flee into different assets, and it's going to cause economic chaos, which is what happened in Argentina. So it caused havoc in the country's economy and a severe recession. So another simple problem, well, if you're going to default, why not just print money to pay off debt? And we've gone over this before. Again, I'll mention Zimbabwe once again, but when a country simply just prints money to pay off debt, the inflation rate's going to skyrocket. It happened in Zimbabwe. It happened post-World War I Germany, when the Germans simply just printed its money to pay off its war reparations. So that clearly is not something that the world wants to have in any country, hyperinflation. Let's take a look at the historical debt to GDP ratio. Okay, so these are historical events affecting the federal debt held by the public. Now, what's kind of interesting, this is not the total debt necessarily. This is just the debt held by the public. So that's why when I talk about total debt, this is actually depending on whether you're talking about the total debt or the debt held by the public, you're going to get different debt to GDP ratios. So at least for this chart, we're only looking at the debt held by the public. So as a percentage of GDP right here, you have around here the War of 1812. Okay. And again, this was a little bit higher, but notice as the war ended, you had, the government basically had no debt around this time here, very little debt around this time. And what big incident happened here? This is obviously Civil War. So there's a lot of government borrowing, but again, the trend is after each significant war, the government basically, paid down the debt and debt to the point where prior to the entry of World War I, there's again very little debt, and then during World War I, a lot of debt, and then notice again after World War I, a lot of debt was paid off, and but as the world emerged into war, World War II, the United States incurred even more debt, much more significant than it had in the past. So World War II was a period where the U.S., the debt to GDP ratio that was held by the public was extremely high. And then again, after World War II, you saw not a complete payoff of the debt, but the percentage went down and down. Again, if you look at this period right here, in the 70s, you have the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War, you have more and more debt. Okay. And right here, though, there was no war here. So the trend, if you look at the historical debt to GDP ratio, it's somewhat like a predictable pattern. During periods of war, the government will borrow a lot of money, from the public, and you're going to have a high debt to GDP ratio. And when the war is over, there's a conscientious effort made to pay down the debt. Here, there is no big war effort. Now, there is the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan, but this here represents more of, what ends up happening is that the debt isn't really going down, and this is the Great Recession, so to speak, of 2008. And to date, in this, the percentage of debt to GDP has only gone up and up. So that's kind of the problem that you see facing the United States. It's not necessarily the debt that is going up, but it's a debt to GDP. So yes, the nominal value is going up. That might be an issue, but when the debt to GDP ratio is going up with no really end in sight, that becomes a problem. So what are the trends that we talked about? Again, during times of war, the U.S. has trended towards running a budget deficit rather than a surplus. So at least in the United States, it's been quite some time since the United States has ran a budget surplus. During World War II, the government ran a huge deficit, and so the U.S. GDP ratio was over 100% at its peak. So what's troubling is that in 2012, during relative peace, the U.S. total debt, so not only the debt held by the public, but the total debt, which includes the total debt held by the public, the total debt to GDP ratio actually exceeded that 100%. So again, depending on what numbers you're using for debt, either way, it's relatively high during times of peace. But again, this is becoming a problem when our debt is higher than the GDP. When it's over that 100% mark, then you see some problems. So again, with projected budget deficits to continue, the debt will continue to get larger and larger. As long as we continue to have budget deficits, our national debt gets higher and higher and higher. Now, if you want to argue that the United States isn't in as bad of a position as other countries, then you would point out to, well, we're not as bad as other countries. So some troubled countries in 2013, if you want to point them out, would be Greece. Their debt to GDP ratio was 173% debt to GDP ratio, and not very good. And Japan, which has been experiencing a lot of deflation over the past 2 decades, their debt to GDP ratio, 140% debt to GDP ratio. So if you want to look at in these terms, we're not as bad off as Greece and Japan. But if you want to look at nominal figures, we have definitely the highest debt totals of any nation in the world. And you can argue that it is imperative for the United States to fix this looming crisis. So it's a crisis that every politician basically knows about, but in order to tackle it, it's going to require some austerity measures, and that again is very popular with the voting public. So one type of debt that we haven't really talked about, I mentioned earlier on the lecture, is implicit liabilities. So these are actually spending promises made by the government, but not included in the actual debt totals, because this is money that's promised, and it, again, depends on how long people live. For example, Social Security, it is promised to people, but if an individual dies earlier, then less Social Security is going to be paid out. So you can't put a fixed number on it. But again, if you're a private company making out pension payments, then this is part of the balance sheet. You have to count that as a liability. But the government, they're exempt from having to make these types of calculations that private corporations do. The 3 largest implicit liabilities of the American government are going to be the following. Social Security, which is the world's largest pension plan. Medicare, which, again, the cost, especially with President Bush having passed a law that adds prescription medication to being part of Medicare, that really exploded the cost. And Medicaid. And one of the provisions in Obamacare was that Medicaid was expanded. The definition of what it meant to be poor actually expanded, so the Medicaid payrolls increased. So again, more implicit liabilities increasing in the future. So if included in the national debt, the $17.3 trillion figure that we used for the national debt in February 2014 would be actually much higher. Now, how much higher would it be? It's actually pretty unfathomable to think what the U.S. national debt is. So if the government actually prepared its financial reports the way private companies do, the net present value of all debt would be closer to $100 trillion. So again, depending on what type of actuarial tables that you might use, but maybe as low as $65 trillion, as high as $100 trillion. This is a problem. But one, again, that, is there going to be an impending crisis next year? I don't know. Maybe as you're watching this right now, maybe the U.S. stock market is tumbling. Maybe the government has defaulted and things happen. So we don't know when it's going to happen, when it's going to be a big issue, but we see that the debt gets higher and higher. And, it could be the case that something is going to happen. Again, might not happen for 10 years, 15 or 20 years, but this is clearly a problem that's on the horizon. Okay, so let's take a look at an example. Again, it's great to talk about these things, but again, I know your goal is to get that 5 on the AP macro exam, so I want to try to help you with that. So draw here an ADAS graph. an economy in a recession. Okay, so take out this extraneous and draw an ADAS graph, an economy in a recession. So let's go ahead and stop right there, and let's draw this ADAS graph here. So remember, on the y-axis, you're going to have the aggregate price level. So again, if you just write price level, it should be fine. And then here, you're going to have y equals R GDP, so the real GDP. And what you're going to have here is the aggregate demand. So here is the aggregate demand. So label this as AD1. And you are here going to have the aggregate supply. And this is the short run aggregate supply, so SRAS1. And where the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand intersect, that is going to be labeled as Y1, which is the current output here. And this is going to be PL1, so the price level 1 here. What will happen if the government increases taxes? Okay, now keep in mind it's in a recession here, so the potential is going to be greater than the current output here. So the long run aggregate supply curve is going to be a vertical line to the right of Y1 and label this YP. And this is going to be the LRAS. Okay, put LRAS1. And so you're in this recessionary gap here. What will happen if the government increases taxes and decreases spending to reduce the deficit and lower the national debt? So this is something that we covered when we dealt with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. But we didn't really focus on the deficit as much. The goal was the short term to try to stimulate the economy, to get the aggregate demand right here in order to close the recessionary gap. Now, that's fine and good, but if you do that, then you're going to increase the budget deficit. And if the goal was to balance the budget, then the idea is that let's increase taxes and decrease spending. Let's use austerity. This is something that Europe actually did during their crisis. So rather than try to help the economy in the short run and stimulate aggregate demand, they enacted a series of tax hikes and decrease government spending to try to balance the budget. And so in doing so, they made the recession worse. So what happens is that when that happens, when taxes are increased and spending is decreased, then the aggregate demand actually shifts to the left. And what you have here is, yes, you have a lower price level and the output is further away. So this is the idea that, yeah, you want to balance the budget. So good job, you do balance the budget. But the downside is that you worsen the recession. So go ahead and pick your poison, what you want to do. Again, the Keynesian solution is definitely not going to be focused on balancing the budget. It's going to be trying to increase that aggregate demand and then maybe worry about the budget deficit later. Again, there's pros and cons with both approaches. But again, as far as this AP exam is concerned, this is a graph that would be used to illustrate the example that I gave you here. So let's take a look at example number 2. This is a little bit more simpler multiple choice question. So if the government spending exceeds tax revenue, so spending exceeds tax revenue, then this is going to be a budget surplus. So another way of saying budget surplus is going to be a positive budget balance. So again, before even looking at the choices, understand what it is. If it's a budget, if the government's spending, I'm sorry, this is not a budget surplus here. This is actually the opposite here. This is a budget deficit. Because if spending exceeds tax revenue, then you're spending more than's coming in. So it's not a positive budget balance. In fact, it's a negative. It's not good. It's a negative budget balance. Okay. So which of the following is necessarily true? So is it a positive budget balance? That is absolutely incorrect. It's a negative budget balance. Is it a budget deficit? Absolutely. Is it a recession? Okay. Now, in times of a recession, does the government spending sometimes exceed tax revenue? Yes, sometimes, but it's not necessarily true. So we can't mark this as being absolutely correct. So only 2 is correct. So this is incorrect. This is incorrect. 1 and 3 is incorrect. So even if this were true, the fact that 2 and 3 is not an option would make it an irrelevant answer choice here, and E is incorrect. So the correct answer would be 2 only, which is a budget deficit. Okay, let's go ahead and look at example number 3 right here. Okay, which of the following fiscal policies is contractionary? So again, what is contractionary? It means that you want to decrease the aggregate demand. And again, there's 3 different tools that are commonly used for contractionary fiscal policy. The first one would be decreased spending, because you're contracting the economy. And when I say spending, I mean government spending. So that's assumed right there. Or you can increase taxes, because people aren't going to spend as much money, so you're going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So increase taxes. And then the third one would be to decrease transfer payments. So this would be to lower the amount of money given Social Security payments, which is essentially an increase in taxes. So will increasing taxes, yes, that will contract, and increasing spending, this is not. So that is incorrect here. Okay. Will decreasing taxes? No. Decreasing spending? Yes, but again, decreasing taxes is an expansionary measure, not contractionary. Increasing taxes, absolutely. And decreasing spending, bingo. This is looking like the correct answer, but let's go ahead and look at the other choices. Maybe there's a better answer. Decreasing taxes, nope. And increasing spending, nope. These are expansionary, so this is incorrect. None of the above, because C is correct, then E is also incorrect. So the correct answer is going to be C. Again, notice on the multiple choice section, you're going to have a lot of these types of questions where you have to have a working understanding of how the aggregate demand shifts based on taxes and spending and fiscal policy. They're really connected together. What I found is with macro, if you understand these concepts, just master it, then a lot of it's linked. Interest rates, aggregate demand. So it's very important to know this. And again, with that being the case on the multiple choice, you can write as freely as you want on the actual test booklet. So make it a point to cross off things and make notes as much as possible if it's going to help you land the correct answer. And the final example here. Which of the following reasons, which of the following reasons is reason to be concerned about perpetual budget deficits? So let's take a look at some of these reasons and see, why might these budget deficits, why might the outcomes of these budget deficits be cause for concern? The crowding out, absolutely crowding out effect, that is definitely a reason to be concerned. Government defaults. Absolutely. That's going to be something that is an issue. Happened in Argentina in 2001. Hasn't happened yet in the United States. Let's keep our fingers crossed. The opportunity cost of future interest payments. Absolutely. When you accrue debt, you're adding interest and interest payments, and it gets higher and higher. So the current income is basically being used to, pay interest. So as we build up a higher and higher deficit, basically it means less and less for future generations. Absolutely. Higher interest rates leading to decreased long-run growth. Absolutely. As if we have higher and higher interest rates, it becomes more difficult for the private sector to basically thrive. So basically, A, B, and C, and D are all correct. So the correct answer, because they are all correct, this is correct, this is correct, this is correct. The correct answer is E, all of the above. So again, the takeaway from this is that, yes, is there a place for deficits? Yes. Is it a good idea to have a balanced budget every year? Probably, but are there times when, using government spending to stimulate the economy, is there a case to be made that that might be helpful? Absolutely. But at the same time, if you run deficit after deficit after deficit, then it's going to add to the national debt, and you can have some long-term problems as a result. Thank you for watching educator.com.